Deputy Vice-Chancellor, distinguished guests, friends and colleagues, welcome to the 7th Annual Mike Jackson Lecture. My name is Amanda Gregory and I'm the Director of the Centre for Systems Studies. Our speaker today is Professor Charles Foster, who is a renowned writer, traveller, veterinarian, taxidermist, barrister and philosopher. Now, just before I hand over to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Professor Kevin Kerrigan, I want to give you a little background on the lecture series and what will be happening today. The lecture series is supported by a donation from Andrew and Valerie Chen. Andrew is an alumnus of Hull, and although Andrew and Valerie are not able to be with us today, they send their very best wishes to you all. So I'd really like to thank them for their generous gift to the university, which has enabled us to host high-profile lectures on systems thinking and celebrate significant research in our discipline. At the request of Andrew and Valerie, the lecture series has been named after Mike Jackson, who was the founding director of our Centre for Systems Studies back in 1992. And he was also the first dean of the Hull University Business School. Mike is here and he will participate in the discussions later this evening. Now, just a few words about our Centre for Systems Studies. The Centre was founded 32 years ago, and we aim to promote systems thinking and understanding about how systems can be used to create transformative change in complex systems at all scales, from the emergence of local community action and business ecosystems through to the impact of global policy interventions. Let me tell you a little bit about the format of this evening's event. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, who is going to introduce our speaker. Charles will then give his lecture entitled, "What are humans?" The question almost never asked and never answered by anyone. Following that, Mike Jackson will join Charles for a discussion on his ideas. This event is being recorded, and we will make the recording available to everyone who has signed up. We have about 1,000 people who have joined us online, and if you are having any technical difficulties online, then please put a note in the chat box and our support colleagues will do whatever they can to assist. Without further ado, please now let me hand over to Professor Kevin Kerrigan to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Amanda, and welcome everybody, and in the room and also online. I'm just looking to see the cameras to say hello. It's my absolute pleasure and delight to introduce Professor Charles Foster, our high-profile speaker for the 2024 annual Mike Jackson Lecture. Charles has a PhD in law and bioethics from the University of Cambridge and is a qualified veterinary surgeon. He retains an active interest in veterinary medicine, particularly general wildlife and large animal medicine, and is a member of the Council of the Association of British Veterinary Acupuncturists. Currently, Charles is a Fellow of Exeter College at the University of Oxford, where he teaches medical law and ethics. That's not all he does, though, because he's also a barrister and a part-time judge of the Crown Court and the County Court. And we've just been comparing notes on the barristers of the northeast of England because we share the same profession, and Charles is well experienced at the bar. In fact, he was telling me a little earlier that his first ever case was in Hull Magistrates Court defending one of two young gentlemen who had been fighting in a pub. So he's done his bit for the peace and tranquility of this great city. Also at the bar, Professor Foster has been involved in some of the key cases in medical law, including the challenge at the European Court of Human Rights to Belgian and French laws regarding euthanasia. Charles is also a writer, and his books venture into many fields, including law, philosophy, natural history, anthropology, archaeology, travel, evolutionary biology, and theology. He says of his writings that they are all attempts to answer the questions, who or what are we? And what on earth are we doing here? And these things are at the crux of his research and his associated writings. And also it's this search for a satisfactory legal anthropology. He's concerned that we make decisions, crucially affecting human welfare, without having any real idea of what sort of creatures we are. To understand this better, Charles has spent periods living as a badger, an otter, an urban fox, a red deer, and a swift. I did read that out, and hopefully Charles will elaborate further in a while. In one way or another, he says he has spent most of his years being an animal, or at least trying to. In his book, Being a Beast, in which Charles's experience of living as other animals are recounted, is a New York Times bestseller. It was longlisted for the Bale Gifford Prize and the Wainwright Prize for Nature Writing, and it won the French 2000 Damy Literary Prize and the Ig Nobel Prize for Biology in 2016. Without further ado, I give you Charles Foster.
Thank you very much for that extravagantly generous introduction, which is going to leave you all crushingly disappointed. So I begin with an apology for the disappointment which you're going to experience in the wake of that. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for your tremendous hospitality. I've been for a long time an admirer of what you're doing here in relation to systems thinking. I have only one quibble. And that is, you shouldn't call it systems thinking, you should call it thinking, because it's the only way to do proper cognition. I started off the journey today at Oxford Station. A few years ago at Oxford Station, there were three very famous philosophers. They were waiting for a train. One was Wittgenstein, another was the philosopher of law, H.L.A. Hart, and the other was Elizabeth Anscombe. They were engaged in deep metaphysical discourse. So much so that when the train came in, they didn't realize that it had come in. Just as it was pulling out of the platform, they noticed what was happening, and Elizabeth Anscombe and H.L.A. Hart detached themselves from Wittgenstein, ran down the platform, threw the train door open, and just managed to hop on. Wittgenstein was left standing on the platform disconsolate. He was plainly upset, and so a woman who was also on the platform came to him and said, "Don't worry, there's another train to London which leaves in an hour." To which Wittgenstein said, "You don't understand. They came to see me off." Now, some of you may recognize that story. It was a story told by the late and very lamented Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi, and he told it in support of two propositions. Firstly, that you should be extremely cautious in accepting advice about how to live in the real world of trains from anyone who purports to do philosophy. And secondly, that it's a good idea when you start off to know where you're going to end up. Well, I purport to do philosophy, and so you should take with more than a pinch of salt everything that I'm going to say. And secondly, I am not sure where I'm going to end up either. So another reason for apology. To know how to live well as a human being, it would seem to me, we need to know what sort of creatures we are and what sort of place we live in. If we don't know what we are and to what we might and should aspire, we might, even if we're content with our lives, and perhaps particularly if we are content with our lives, be letting our lives go off half-cock. We might be squeezing far less out of our 70 years and 10 than we might be. We might be doing ourselves harm. We might be creatures who are designed to run on unleaded, and we might be filling ourselves up with diesel. If we don't know where we are, we might be responding inappropriately to the cosmos. We might be wandering around metaphorically naked when it's freezing cold. We might be saying that our frostbite is unavoidable wear and tear. That will be better off if we know it's cold and if we put on a coat. The study of humans is called anthropology, of course. It's a strange subject because it makes no attempt at all, so far as I can see, to say what humans are. Imagine a course on rodents, which didn't begin by defining rodent. Imagine a course on rodents in deserts, which didn't say what was meant by a desert. Yet that's what we do with the study of ourselves. You'll remember the story of Petrarch on Mount Veretout. He took out a copy of Augustine's Confessions. It fell open, exposing this passage. Men go about to wonder at the heights of the mountains and the mighty waves of the sea and the wide sweep of rivers and the circuit of the ocean and the revolution of the stars, but themselves they consider not. And nothing much has changed in relation to the study of anthropology, the study of ourselves, since Petrarch looked at Augustine's Confessions on the mountaintop. I wonder if I'm being rather unkind to anthropologists. Perhaps there isn't a failure to define human, but a refusal to define human. And perhaps there's a refusal because anyone who looks closely at humans is struck dumb with awe at what we are. And realizes that any effort to say what we are is going to be confounded by our complexity, our variety, our depravity, our goodness, our category-busting inconsistency, our vertiginous giganticness, and our piffling littleness. I'm going to suggest that we can draw some conclusions about the sorts of creatures we constitutionally are, and therefore how we should behave, from some facts about ourselves and about our evolutionary history. And the second part of that suggestion about how we should behave is immediately going to raise the eyebrows and the hackles of any of you, and that's all of you in this room, who's ever done any philosophy, because it seems to fall foul of the naturalistic fallacy, the fallacy of deriving an ought from an is. I want to try to preempt those objections by saying just a few things about the is-ought gap. Exactly what Hume's famous claim about is and ought entails is, as you know, bitterly contested and exhaustingly discussed. The whole arena of philosophy which deals with this is littered with the corpses of straw men. What does it mean? It may mean many things, but it means at least that you can infer an ought from an is only if, as well as matters of mere fact, one has an evaluative premise. Now, I don't doubt the utility of that principle. In some situations, it's very useful, but its utility suggests, I hope uncontroversially, it depends on the context. So where there is an overwhelming consensus about the relevant evaluative premise, you can leave the tool of the is-ought distinction in your philosophical toolbox. When there is no such consensus, you need to take it out and use it. Sam Harris, to my eye, has dangerously ignored this distinction. So his naive treatise simply to follow the science can lead in some of the circumstances where he makes those entreaties to some real philosophical sloppiness. And I hope I'm not doing that here. I hope that when I do try to derive conclusions about how we should behave, there is indeed overwhelming consensus about the relevant evaluative principle, or at least agreement amongst most of the friendly people in this lecture theatre about what that evaluative premise is. When we've tried seriously to think about what we are, for most of our history, we've reached for theological language. Theology tends to be better at posing questions and giving ethical guidance than at solving ontological conundrums. So, the psalmist asked, "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" A very good question, the question I'm posing now. The writer purports to answer that question, but he doesn't. He goes on to say, God made man a little lower than the angels, a little lower than the heavenly beings, and crowned him with glory and honor. It's not an answer to the question he posed himself, because it says not what humans are, but where they are in the hierarchy of being. But it is useful. It tells us how to comport ourselves. We should comport ourselves with quasi-divine dignity. It tells us how to behave towards other humans. You mustn't see a creature who's crowned with glory and honor as principally an economic unit, or send it to work in a brothel or a merchant bank. So it's worthwhile advice, but it's not ontological advice. And the same goes really for the idea of the Imago Dei. To know that I'm made in the image of God, assuming that I have a respectful idea of God and don't think of him as a monster, is going to do lots of useful things. It's going to inhibit my self-denigration. It's going to make me denounce sweatshops. It's going to keep me from a career in the financial services industry. But because God is infinitely mysterious, to say that I'm like him is going to tell me little about my nature, except that I too am mysterious. That might be surprisingly practical knowledge, though. It's worth thinking about some of the ways in which our mysteriousness should be reflected in our ways of living and our ways of legislating. The notion of the Imago Dei perhaps means also that we are foundationally creative creatures, since creation is one of God's defining attributes. That is hardly an ontological answer again, but it's worth having. So that's the theologians. Apart from the theologians, the other people who say that they can help us to say what we are various shades of reductionist. And they have various approaches. Some say things like we're higher primates who share lots of our DNA with flatworms. This is true, but it's unhelpful. It falls into exactly the same trap as the psalmist fell into. It says on what branch of the evolutionary tree we're perched, not what we are. If you get marks for answering the question posed by the examiner, the other type of reductionist answer surely fares rather better. Those sorts of answers are things like humans are merely machines, we are cocktails of chemicals. This has the merit of clarity, but it has the demerit of being at odds with everything that we know and feel about ourselves and everything we know and feel about the rest of the cosmos. So I'm going to talk about what humans at bottom might be. In doing that, I'm going to talk about a number of human attributes. And so I have to begin by reminding myself that there's a distinction, or maybe a distinction, between attributes and substance. This was, of course, recognized by Aristotle a very long time ago. It was disinterred in the Middle Ages to defend the doctrine of transubstantiation. Were the Eucharistic bread and wine really the body and blood of Jesus? Yes. So why do they taste like bread and wine? Answer, because they retain the chemical attributes of bread and wine while being in substance the body and blood of Jesus. Now, this distinction sometimes matters profoundly. In my own field of medical ethics, for example, we might be able to agree that practical reason is a defining attribute of humans. But does that mean that someone stops being human if they have dementia or traumatic brain injury, which robs them of that attribute. I hope not. I hope that a patient with dementia is still wholly human for all purposes. Is a toddler who is very good at Lego but hopeless with Logos still human? I would hope that the answer is yes. We can talk later, if it's helpful, about the significance of that distinction. Perhaps we could discuss whether we need to fall back on notions like the Imago Dei in order to get at the substance of humans rather than just enumerating their attributes. But for the moment, I'm just going to park that thought. We can know some things about ourselves as a species. We can at least reconstruct our evolutionary history. We can see where we've come from. We can see how we've behaved in the past and how we behave in our present. And by noting how we've judged that behavior, we can conclude something about our moral nature. We can, for example, record what our metaphysical predilections are. We can look at the way that we structure our societies. We can look at our aesthetic concerns. We can look at our epistemic queasiness and our pathetic desire for certainty. The process of looking at our past in order to understand our present is valuable, I think. Just as our childhood years determine to a large extent what we are as adults, and in particular they determine the content of our subconscious, which is overwhelmingly the most important part of us. We as intellectual people, in inverted commas, tend to preference relatively unimportant attributes like the ability to think in an explicitly cognitive way. But most of what we are is like an iceberg underneath the surface. And our childhood as a species determines what we are, at least in the deepest, most constitutional parts of us. So, what's in our childhood history? Well, depending on how you do the calculation, between 85 and 95% of our time as behaviorally modern humans, since the Upper Paleolithic, about 45,000 years ago, has been spent as hunter-gatherers. So that means that not just our childhood as a species has been spent as hunter-gatherers, but almost all our life as a species has been spent that way. That's what we really are. If you rip the immaculate Italian suit off the New York headhunter, you will find beneath it a hairy Upper Paleolithic bison hunter. It's not the focus of my remarks this afternoon, but it may well be that lots of our modern illnesses of mind and spirit and body politic result from locking up the caveman in us. There's lots of nonsense talked about the Paleolithic diet, but there's lots of sense that could be talked about the Paleolithic mental and spiritual diet. I want to focus briefly on 5 aspects of this formative hunter-gatherer time. And I want to suggest that these aspects go to the core of what we are, and therefore how we should be, how we should behave, how we should comport ourselves, how we should respect ourselves, how we should legislate. The first of those is wandering. We are built to walk. Because we're higher off the ground, because of our beautiful long hind legs than other mammals, we have a grand perspective of the land over which we walk. So there is some sense in which we understand the paths along which the wildebeest on the East African plains, where we grew up as a species, we understand those paths better than the wildebeest themselves. That perspective might have contributed to our tendency to generalize and to theorize, because that tendency is one of a big picture, big vista thinking. As we raised ourselves up on our hind legs on the East African veldt, we saw things that were previously invisible to our evolutionary forebears. So there's a dangerous tendency, simply by reason of the length of our legs, to theorize, but the walking kept our feet literally and metaphorically on the ground. We settled, eventually. Settling is very dangerous. We know that to stop moving is deadly. If blood stops moving through your coronary arteries, you die. If a river becomes too sluggish, it starts to smell. That's what happened to us when we stopped wandering. So in the Neolithic, the time of first settlement, lots of things started to die and to smell. We see then the death of the egalitarianism, which typifies hunter-gatherer communities. We see the birth of chauvinism of many kinds. We see the tyranny of supply and demand. We see consequential violence. Steven Pinker, I hope you agree, is entirely wrong in his reconstruction of the history of human violence. We see the exhaustion of natural resources in the areas around settlements. We see a colonial attitude towards the non-human world, which previously we had seen as sacred. We see the birth of politics as we know it now, which is a kind of death. And as communities got larger, trust and shame were unable to police communities effectively. And the law, with all its jackbooted lieutenants, goose-stepped in to do the job which trust and shame had previously done. If you think that all that is hysterical overstatement, perhaps you'll take God's word for it, because in the Judeo-Christian tradition, he makes no secret of his preference for the wanderer. That's the root of the Cain and Abel story. The settled agriculturalist offering is less acceptable to God than that of the Bedouin who wanders with his flocks over the hills of the Near East. The first farmer is also the first murderer. Violence and envy enter the world with settlement. Israelite identity was forged during the wanderings in the wilderness, just as our identity was forged during our hunter-gatherer wandering. In the Jewish story, God traveled with his people, crouched in an ark carried on their shoulders. Even when the Israelites had a city of their own, there was no clear endorsement of settlement. Right at the center of the city, at the dark heart of the Jerusalem temple, the ark still stood with its carrying poles still attached. This was still a mobile God, still a Bedouin God, still a wandering God. At the festival of Sukkot, Jews live outside in a shelter through which it's mandatory to be able to see the stars in the sky as a remembrance that they are at root a Bedouin people, as we all are. At every Shabbat meal, the one still point in the week, what is explicitly remembered? The Exodus, the wandering story. At Pesach, Passover, Jews who are comfortably resident in Jerusalem raise their glasses, and even though they may have been there for generations, they express their ancient hope next year in Jerusalem. There is still contingency built in to Jewish identity. The most settled Jews are still on the road. In the Christian tradition, pilgrimage is central, whether it's actual pilgrimage, almost always to places that were originally obscure, or places that are metaphorical, as in Bunyan's stories. And it's not surprising. Foxes have holes, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, declared Jesus. And if you look at a map of his peregrinations up and down the Holy Land, they're exhausting to read about. And we see the same in every religious tradition. There's a command to leave wherever it is you become comfortable and to reclaim your authentic hunter-gatherer roots. So if, as I think is right, religions are schemes for becoming what we should be, one of the things that we should be is a hunter-gatherer. One of the things I notice about wandering is that wanderers, unlike people who sit at a desk, are constantly crossing boundaries, frontiers. And I'll return to that thought in a moment. Second hunter-gatherer aspect, a relationship with the non-human world. I've touched on this already, and I agree that we need to be very careful about extrapolating from modern hunter-gatherer communities to the ancient past, but there is near universal agreement that prehistorical hunter-gatherers saw themselves as part of the world rather than separated from it. They saw themselves as ensouled, and they saw everything else as ensouled. They had agency, and so did the bison who they killed, so did the trees, so did the rocks. And of course that presented a tremendous problem. How do you eat morally if eating a plant or an animal involves desouling something? So eating in this essentially sacramental world demanded an elaborate choreography of oblation and satisfaction. The bison had to be asked for permission to kill it and eat it. It had to be assured that it was going to be killed and eaten in a dignified way. It turned us, in other words, into essentially and quintessentially liturgical creatures. So we're wired up to assume that the whole cosmos, from stars down to starfish, is sacred. And we're now told that nothing at all is sacred, and it's no wonder we feel uneasy. Third hunter-gatherer aspect, consciousness and storytelling. One of the striking things about ourselves is that we obsessively use personal pronouns. I see, I say. You are, I say. She is, I say. We can't hear the voices of Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, but I think we can infer those pronouns in their mouths from certain types of behavior, such as the way that the human form is represented in Ice Age art, from their funerary practices. And those pronouns are tectonic. We use them so casually, we miss what an astonishingly explicit orientation to the cosmos they indicate. They suggest that I believe that I'm real, and that you're real, and that she is real. And if that's the case, then implicit in their use is the possibility of real relationship. They imply my belief that there is a world outside my own head, and that I can know at least some things about the world outside my own head. They thumb the nose at epistemic despair. They say that I'm not alone, locked up in the echo chamber of my own skull, the most lonely place. Taken with a lot of other evidence, they begin to hint that relationship itself is the web and the weave of the cosmos. Ian McGilchrist, of whom you will all have heard, would put it in more formal philosophical terms and would say that relationship is ontologically prior to the relata. So relationship existed before there were things which could relate to one another. Pronouns indicate a real faith in agency, and it's a hop and a skip from believing in agency to believing in responsibility, to feeling morally obliged, to making us quintessentially moral animals. It's interesting to reflect on how the peculiar type of consciousness, which is human consciousness, might have arisen. There's no overwhelming consensus, as you'll know, about how our behaviorally modern consciousness erupted into the world. But I think most people would agree that the hypothesis of the South African anthropologist David Lewis Williams is at least part of the story, and probably a significant part of the story. He suggested, based on the studies of the San people of southern Africa, that shamanic voyaging, or the induction without such voyaging of altered states of consciousness, might have had something to do with it. So the idea is that by dancing or dehydration or the ingestion of plant hallucinogens, humans might have gone or felt that they had gone to a place other than this, to other realms, perhaps represented by the world on the other side of the cave wall. And from the perspective of those other realms, they look back at the quotidian world that they left and they were able to see it with new eyes, with new perspective. And in particular, they were able to see themselves as distinct, so generating the idea that there is an I. And because you can see your cave mate as well from this other realm, you know that there's a you. Therefore, there can and there must be an I-thou relationship. There have been, so far as I can see, no significant developments in consciousness studies since the Upper Paleolithic. There certainly haven't been any such developments since De Quincey was eating opium, since Humphrey Davy was inhaling nitrous oxide, and William James was trying to make sense of it all. Nobody's been able to suggest with a straight face, or at least with a coherent paper, why natural selection should be remotely interested in promoting our type of consciousness. You don't need that sort of subjective consciousness for anything which is relevant to our mere survival as a species. Of course, it's useful to have theory of mind. It's useful to know what's in your head so that you don't spear me. It's useful to be able to think your way into the mind of the saber-toothed tiger, which might be about to jump on you, but you don't need consciousness for that. Consciousness is no use to Darwin. I mean, all that it's good for is facilitating the sort of relationship which is invisible to natural selection. Now, once you have pronouns, you necessarily have stories. We compulsively feel that the I, which may have been vouchsafed to us from the perspective of one of those realms, has to be situated somehow in the cosmos. And we tell stories in order to situate it. Maybe that's a consequence of the vertigo that we feel when we don't know where we are or where we come from or where we're going. And that vertigo is perhaps the modern human condition, unmitigated these days by the comfort of religion or any other kind of metaphysical commitment. Fourth hunter-gatherer attribute, a sense that this place is not all that there is. That follows from something of what I've said about shamanic voyaging and the like. My favorite author, Alan Garner, says that everything that humans do is necessarily a votive act. I agree with that. A belief that there are worlds other than the one that we're sitting in now is a hallmark of behaviorally modern humans. If you see grave goods, which denote a belief in other worlds, you have behaviorally modern humans. If you don't, with a mild caveat about Neanderthal burials, you haven't. I've mentioned already the probable role of shamanic voyaging in our understanding of the sorts of animals that we are and the sort of place the cosmos is. The general picture that you get of the hunter-gatherer world is a sort of picture that you get from the writings of Charles Williams. I don't know if you know him. He was one of the Inklings. Of everything being porous, of other worlds bleeding all the time into us and us bleeding into other worlds, of only the thinnest veil separating this reality from other realities, which may very well be more solid than this one. One of the great authorities on Upper Paleolithic religion is Paul Pettit. He asserts that the standard Upper Paleolithic belief was that our agency increases rather than decreases when we die. And that's all of a piece, it seems to me, with Platonism, of a more solid world of the forms. It's of a piece with the Christian teaching about the resurrection of Jesus, so a transphysical body which is more solid than ours, which can pass through walls and was presumably much more sensual than ours. Fifth hunter-gatherer aspect, symbolizing and the use of metaphor. I don't know if you've got a good anthropological museum here in Hull, but if you go to any such museum and walk along the human evolution galleries, looking particularly at the artifacts, they are really boring until you get to the Upper Paleolithic. And then suddenly you have an exuberant explosion of symbols, of things being made to stand for other things while still remaining themselves. We're so used to it that we don't notice how seismic that development was. So imagine that an Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherer is carving a piece of mammoth ivory into the form of a bear. It's still a piece of mammoth ivory, but it's also a bear. If a piece of mammoth ivory can be made to do that, is there any limit to the possibility of the world? Everything is potentially everything else. This is a world of shape-shifting, of potentially infinite shape-shifting. So McGilchrist, again, who I've mentioned, sees the use of metaphor as one of the quintessential human characteristics. And that seems to me to be right. We are metaphorizing creatures. We unmake ourselves, it would follow, when we become literal. Something to which we may return. So, taking stock of that, can we conclude anything about what we are from what we know about human thriving? Well, in order to do that, let's go to Martha Nussbaum. There's a fair amount of agreement about what we need in order to thrive. Decent cultures have recognized that agreement in their norms and in their laws. Martha Nussbaum, who follows Aristotle and just about everyone else who's wondered systematically about human flourishing, identifies 10 core needs. So life, unsurprisingly, is the most fundamental. All the other characteristics are contingent on it, and the others are bodily health, bodily integrity, the use of your senses, your thought and your imagination, emotion, including the ability to become attached to something other than yourself, practical reason, which includes knowing what's good and what's not, and cohabiting comfortably with your own conscience, affiliation, including the ability to be empathetic and sympathetic, a relationship with other species in the world, of which humans are just a part, play, because life isn't all about measurable productivity. Laughter has had, most people agree, a really important role in human evolution, and control of some degree over the environment, which would include political freedom and the ownership of adequate resources. So she casts her net very wide. There's little about human living that she doesn't catch. The list might seem rather trite, but it provides at least a set of pigeonholes in which to file our thoughts about the things we need in order to thrive. And can't we transform that list easily into a set of defining human attributes? And the reason I say that is because surely to thrive best, we act in accordance with our true natures. So maybe use this list when you're next asked at a party who you are. Instead of saying, I'm Mike Jackson, declare I'm an embodied, sensual, thinking, imaginative, emotional creature who has a meaningful relationship with the non-human world. So this list of Nussbaum is often used in the academy. I've cited it myself hundreds of times, more or less unreflectively. But something strange set me thinking about it more seriously quite recently. I was sitting in an icy church in Yorkshire, and a property developer in a suit which was stretched almost to bursting point by many dinners of steak and kidney pie, was reading with no apparent embarrassment from the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are those who mourn, he boomed in this vast, commanding voice. Blessed are the poor in spirit. And I listened to this as if hearing it for the first time. What on earth could it mean? Or perhaps it meant nothing on earth. Perhaps it contained truths for another realm altogether. If it did, it seemed to me that that other realm was a more desirable place than the world in which people like that property developer existed. Anyway, the vicar, who obviously had an eye to the roof fund, didn't preach on the text of the day, nor did he rudely mention the text of the Magnificat, in which the mighty will be put down from their seats and the hungry filled with good things and the rich sent empty away. But I was horrified. The dispossessed, apparently, were the only ones who possessed anything at all. The moral centre of the cosmos was amongst the kids scavenging on the rubbish dumps outside Fortaleza. They were in the hospices. I mean, what on earth would Martha Nussbaum make of that? I mean, here were categories, the mourners, the poor, and so on, who at first blush didn't seem to be captured by her list. And not only were they said, with this shrillness which appalled and fascinated me, to be flourishing, but to be the only ones who were flourishing at all. Wasn't it the profoundest sort of perversion to worship suffering and poverty? Well, what sort of life-denying deviant makes the hospice or the funeral parlour the normative human experience? So I walked away from that thought, as most of us walk away from all important things, but the thought pursued me, and it raised its head uncomfortably whenever I was feeling comfortable and self-satisfied. At a good dinner, at a reassuring diagnosis, whenever, it didn't happen very often, but whenever anyone said something nice about one of my books, when the bank account swelled, it was stealing my joy. It was denigrating things that I thought were good. I desperately wanted Martha Nussbaum back, which is something which is not often said. If that thought had only been Christian, it would have been fine. I could and I would have dismissed it as a hysterical artifact of febrile first century apocalypticism, but it wasn't. It was there, and it was strident everywhere I looked. It's there in the prophets of Israel, it's there in the mendicants of Hinduism and Buddhism, it's there in the skepticism of Lao Tzu, it's there in the generosity which is enjoined by Islam. It's everywhere. And it was there too in my intuitions, and I didn't like it at all. Then things took a very different turn. For a book I was writing, I started to reread lots of old stories which I knew from childhood and had read to my own children at bedtime. And I began to see that I'd often failed to see the wood for the trees. These old stories weren't intended just to titillate or to make long winter evenings bearable. They were meant to say something very fundamental about the sorts of creatures we are. They were meant to answer the psalmist's question. They were meant to do, but more fundamentally, the work which Nussbaum had begun. I knew about that aspiration that these stories had to answer the psalmist's question. I'd assumed without looking hard that they had failed, really because the brief was such a big one. But as I continued to look at these stories, it occurred to me that this failure might not be as complete as I'd thought. Many of these old stories did give an account of origins and status. Lots of them described and celebrated lots of those characteristics in Martha Nussbaum's list. But they did so not by listing quintessential characteristics, not by piling up propositions, but by telling stories. So, this is my great insight. Stories tell stories. And by doing so, they do something which is different in quality from simply distilling the principles from stories and filing them in a set of cognitive pigeonholes. So that insight, which is blindingly obvious to all small children and to all intelligent readers, had completely passed me by. And this is what academia does to you. Anyway, having seen that, there was no stopping me. What could stories do that the distilled principles of stories could not do? For they seemed real in a way that principles were not, even if the stories concerned fanciful worlds and outlandish creatures. The stories concerned embodied people in conversation with the world. They had bodies and they had relationship at the core, and they moved through time. Stories, like us, have a beginning and a middle and an end. So you can see there was, by now, no end to my excitement with the trite. The stories told us more about us than Nussbaum's list told us, because we ourselves are stories. And it takes a story to know a story. But what did they tell us about ourselves? That needed lots of reading. Slowly, I think, a little bit of the fog began to clear, and what I saw was very strange indeed. There in the stories, as I'd already noticed, were Nussbaum's characteristics. Cheered on, expounded, advocated. We should all become heroes. We should avoid becoming anti-heroes. That was to be expected. I'd seen that all along. But how and where were those characteristics shown to their greatest effect? And the answer became clear. They were shown on the actual and the metaphorical edges of life, not at the centre. So knights go out from the comfort of courts and they get lost in woods. And only when they get lost in dark places are they able to be properly knightly. Dante only gets visions when he gets lost in a dark wood. When all is lost, and only when all is lost, are there great riches. So it was all of a piece with those disturbing lines from the Sermon on the Mount. But then I wondered, isn't this just a literary device? I mean, stories have to be interesting to hold listeners' attention, and extreme situations are more entertaining to listen to than a story of an okay day at the office. But it wasn't that, or it wasn't just that. These old tales were saying something normative about what we are when all the pretension is stripped away, and about how we should be at all times. They were hinting that if we could only see it, we are always lost in a wood. We're always teetering on a precipice. We're always destitute. We are always the only one standing between a fire-breathing dragon and a fair maiden chained to a post, and we should behave like that. And my mind slipped back to Varanasi, and I remember there an emaciated beggar in a saffron robe holding out his bowl to me. I walked past him without putting anything in it, and he screamed at me, "I am you." And my mind slipped back to my discomfort when a friend asked me to consider giving a kidney to someone I didn't know. So Nussbaum's list is embedded in the old stories, but they said better than she did what we were, or at least they identified better some of the attributes that we had. One of the reasons for that, as I've said, was that the stories that all humans are involve relationship with people, with places, with ideas, with gigantic lizards, with gods, with the world that is outside the heroes' skulls. Nussbaum had identified engagement with the world outside our own skulls as central to human thriving and human definition. We couldn't consider humans either as a species or as individuals in isolation. We weren't brains in vats or even mind, body, spirit unities in vats. We bled into the world and the world bled into us. And so, in order to know what we were, because this porous membrane that we have on our boundaries, we needed to know what was being transfused into us. So that's a big ask, isn't it? It's a really hubristic ask. I mean, so big that few of us bother to ask, at least in a systematic way. The nature of reality, discuss. Do the old stories say anything about that? Well, I think they do. The very old stories and the very new stories say essentially the same. You'll remember the argument that Albert Einstein and Niels Bohr had. Einstein said, in principle, you could find a theory which would predict how everything in the world behaved. Not so, replied Bohr. It's not going to be possible because the behavior of everything is affected by the observer. Now, we know, as a matter of fact now, that Bohr was right. It means that the cosmos is, at bottom, a relational place. It is a vast conversation in which everything from subatomic particle to planet is communicating with everything else, is listening to everything else, is being influenced by everything else. In that sense, everything is one. And that's not a conclusion which we have to draw from the language of mystics who spend their lives cross-legged in meditation, talking about becoming one with the cosmos. We can derive it from the fact of quantum non-locality, which has been demonstrated by those clever people at CERN. So if two bodies have been close to one another, they will affect the behavior of one another forever, at whatever distance, instantaneously. That's not because they send messages to one another infinitely faster than the speed of light. It's because they are part of the single great organism that we call the universe, or, if you prefer, what we call reality. So we're back to McGilchrist and relationship being prior to relata. Relationship is a more fundamental constitution of reality than the forces which bind atoms together. Those subatomic forces themselves are examples of relationship. But while in some sense everything is one, everything in another sense is many. And that's no contradiction when you think about, for example, a magnet. It's an undivided whole, one magnet. If you cut off the North Pole, you're not left with the South Pole. Distinct North Poles presuppose their opposite. You've got to have a South Pole in order to have a North Pole. Magnets demand both. So oneness of the sort I've been talking about depends on variegation. The fact that our experiences are our own declares our conviction that we are one in a universe of completely dazzling otherness. Our experience of beauty depends on and declares variety. We might look up and say that a perfectly blue sky is beautiful, but if everything were an undifferentiated, contourless, seamless blue, we wouldn't think it was beautiful. So beautiful blueness depends on beautiful unblueness. The cosmos isn't like a pint of homogenized milk. That's not what oneness means. It still letters the cosmos like a typical British high street with the same mobile phone shops and sandwich joints on it. It's an incontinent generator of variety. It's very good at spewing individuals. Now, if you increase the number of individuals, you increase the total length of edge in the cosmos. You increase the number of different viewpoints in the cosmos. So the cosmos seems to be an edge generator, a viewpoint multiplier. So if the cosmos is a conversation, a sort of festival of otherness in a huge marquee of unity, then all the time as humans, we're peering over the edge of ourselves into something else. And so is everything peering over the edge of itself, from electrons to blue whales. Why do small animals do well and big animals do badly in cold conditions? Other way around, actually. Small animals do badly. It's because the surface area of a sphere is 4 pi r squared. So the squaring keeps shrews from cold places. So the greater the volume, the smaller the ratio of the surface area to the volume. And so the smaller the area over which vital heat can be lost. So a muskox, vast thing, which is very happy in cold places, has less surface to its volume than a mouse has. A mouse is edgier than a muskox. It impinges relatively more on the outside world. It's more vulnerable. Its surface relates more to everything that is outside it. A mouse is a more relational entity than a muskox. So a mouse or a shrew is more cosmic than a muskox because the cosmos is woven of relationship, and a muskox is less relational because of that squaring. So everything we know that really matters, everything that goes to what we think we really are and to what we really value in the world, we know by encounter, we know by experience. We know it as a function of our edginess, of our ability to be affected, of our porosity. Phenomenology trumps every equation. Data give way to intuition. If I have a complete set of data about you, that doesn't tell me anything very important about you, actually. Scientists can tell us things like our weight or our pulse or the species of flower that we're admiring or the origin of the rocks we're standing on. But a complete accumulation of information about those things won't begin to account for the value I ascribe to my life or the flower or the piece of rock or whatever it is. And that accords with our sense of ourselves, doesn't it? It accords with our sense of the precariousness that we feel when we bother to consider our predicament seriously. It accords with the vertigo that we feel when we look up and out, which is the direction which is forced on us by our biology. It accords with our feeling about the salience of the moment. It accords with our adventurousness and our timorousness. And it accords, going back to where we were earlier, it accords with every one of those good old stories about forests and mountain trolls and treasure trove and journeys to outlandish places. And it accords too with what we've been looking at from our Upper Paleolithic past. It accords with our knowledge of ourselves as wanderers, because then we were stepping with every moment of our lives over a different edge into a different place. From our relationship with the non-human world, where every organism was regarded as a distinctly and sole entity, an individual of moral weight, which itself at its death passed over the edge of the world. It accords with the intuitions from our consciousness. It accords with the assertion of our individuation, which is inherent in our obsessive use of pronouns. It accords with our intuition that there are other worlds out there, that there's commerce with these other realms. It accords with the infinite individuation which comes from symbolism and the use of metaphor, in which everything can be anything else. Because if everything can be everything else, there's an infinite number of edges. So, drawing all this together, if we are, as I'm suggesting, quintessentially edge people in a world which is woven of edges, we'd expect to thrive when we're most edgy. And we do. We see life best from the perspective of the edge of life. The best literature is the literature of the dispossessed. Salvador Dali went to sleep holding a key over a metal pail, so that when he dropped off, the key fell into the pail, clanged, and woke him up and catapulted him into a hypnagogic state, an edge place between ordinary consciousness and sleeping consciousness, in which the great visions which are grafted into his paintings were given to him. We only ever see the things that matter out of the corner of our eye. We see it at the edge of vision. What matters in a poem is not what's there, readable in the lines. It's there implicit in the poem, between the lines. Try to construe the poem, and you will kill it. We murder to dissect. Redemption of all sorts, in all traditions, happens at the edges, whether it's the freeing of the maiden tied to the dragon's post, whether it's enlightenment in the Eastern traditions happening on the edge of hunger, at the edge of ordinary consciousness. In the Christian tradition, whether it's produced by the death of a man who'd been edgy from conception onwards on a rubbish heap beyond the edge of a metropolis, whether it's by political revolution of all sorts, because all revolutions begin in bedrooms and kitchens, never in parliaments or cabinet rooms. All of which is to say that I think that I begin to see something of what those weird verses in the Sermon on the Mount might mean. Do you remember in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, one of the Narnia books, the gallant mouse, Reepicheep, is excited when the seawater turns sweet, because that means that the edge of the world is near. He refuses to go back with the others, but he paddles his little coracle frantically. He knows he's going towards the edge of the world, and we last see him at the crest of a wave which, just like time and reality itself, I suppose, pushes on towards new possibility. It's as if he's become part of the wave. Graham Greene, one of the supreme chroniclers of the human condition, who himself made a pretty fair stab at answering the psalmist's question, said that he would choose as the epigraph for his novels an observation in Browning's Bishop Blougram's Apology. Our interests on the dangerous edge of things, the honest thief, the tender murderer, the superstitious atheist. And Greene is a great novelist because he knew that normal thieves are honest, normal murderers are tender, and all atheists are superstitious. So, what are human beings? This is my answer to the examiner's question. Humans are edge people. There's nothing we can do about it. We're poised on all sorts of edges. We're poised on biological edges because we're only a heartbeat away from the cemetery. We're poised on the edge of all sorts of ontologically queasy places. And we are edge people in a cosmos which is characterized by edges. And therefore, we will relate to it in a more satisfactory way if we acknowledge our edginess. Edges are of the essence. The present which we inhabit is a rolling edge with beneath it, this is Bergson, isn't it, I suppose, all the rolling edges of the past, like geological strata. We're constantly broadcasting and receiving over the boundaries of ourselves if we're being proper human beings, because relationality is the fabric of reality. So I'm going to shut up now, and then Mike Jackson can tell me where I've got this dramatically wrong. And I look forward to his cross-examination. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Charles. Excellent stuff. I promise you I'll come back to edges towards the end and allow us to put this thing back together again. But I would like to initially start to untangle some of it before putting it all back together again. I mean, all the things that I've read of yours are concerned with this basic theme as what sort of creatures are we as human beings, and that gives a kind of unity to a lot of things that you've written and a lot of things that you say. And you brilliantly encapsulated that tonight. It wasn't the starting point, but one of the things that you thought it was important to do in getting towards that notion of what we were as humans is to have a look at what animals were. And to come back to the point that Kevin made, the book being a beast, you tried to get into the minds of animals, actually lived as a badger. Sorry to bring this up again. Fox.
As long as you don't talk about eating worms, I'll be your friend.
Well, you've got no chance. You've got no choice because 90% of their diet was worms, so you had to eat worms, didn't you, if you're going to get close to a badger? Well, why start with animals in this quest to find out what humans were?
Because they're different from us. And I thought that if I could relate to something as different from me as a fox or a badger or a red deer, perhaps there was some possibility of relating to my wife, and my children, and my best friends. So I am desperate to convince myself that otherness is not always inaccessible, and that relationship is possible, that I am not bound to have conversations which are all the time at cross purposes. And I thought that if I could enter the sensory world of something non-human, then using the skills which I had learnt in the woods and the mountains, I could come back and be a slightly less unsatisfactory father and husband and friend. So another way of putting it is that this weird project of zoological method acting was acting like a sort of empathy gym. So empathy is like everything else in the world. You get better at it, I suppose, the more you work at it. And so if you do something like try to work out what it is to be a swift, then you might be able to work out what on earth is your teenage daughter thinking about. So the purpose of becoming a badger is to be a better human being.
Okay, and in a sense it's getting into another mind, isn't it? Another way of appreciating the world, because badgers bring forth the world in a different
It's a general inquiry into the accessibility of otherness, yeah. It's an attempt to convince myself that I'm not forever alone, which is, I think, something that we all feel. So how many people are sitting in this lecture theatre? Maybe 80 or so. So that's 80 cosmoses, far less accessible to me than the most distant universe, and hugely more interesting to me than the goings-on in the different cosmos. I would like to be able to think that we can talk, and that's what this project was about.
You did say, though, that you only succeeded for a millisecond in beginning to understand, or being a badger for a millisecond, and that the project as a whole was a slam-dunk failure.
Yes. it convinced me that someone who is more sensitive than I am, a better writer than I am, probably female, probably dyslexic, and therefore not someone who reduces the world to sets of propositions rather than encountering it directly, would be able to make a better stab at the project. And that convinced me that the general project of trying to access the otherness of somebody apart from Charles Foster wasn't in principle doomed to failure. So if this wasn't a completely misconceived project as a matter of principle, then there were reasons to hope that Mike Jackson and I could at one point have a conversation that wasn't at cross purposes. So that's what it was about.
We'll try. The other aspect of it is that you're getting into minds and ways of seeing the world which are sort of radically different, and they're radically different because these animals use different senses in different ways. And it's one of your points, I think, that human beings have become very restricted in the way we use senses. We tend to be visual, we tend to think in abstract conceptual terms.
Yes.
And these other animals have much more direct relationship with their environments, evolved with their environments, use different senses. And
A badger is a pure phenomenologist. Yes.
Yes. And we've lost a lot of that, and that's part of...
So yes, we live almost entirely in, so far as senses are concerned, a visual world. There is a relationship between vision and cognition which is far tighter for evolutionary reasons than the relationship between, say, olfaction and cognition. The whole way in which we understand the world is conceived in terms of our visual images. So we can see that in the way that we talk. If we understand something, we say, I see. And because of the entanglement of our vision and cognition, it means that our understanding of the world is in danger of being self-referential and self-reverential. So if I look at a tree, I get visual images in from the tree, and I reduce those visual images almost immediately into things which have nothing to do with the tree, to remembered fragments of poems about trees, remembered physiological facts about trees. Nothing to do with that tree itself. I've never seen a tree. And I think that's a shame, because I imagine, although I can't know, that a tree is far more interesting, exciting, and colourful and charismatic than Charles Foster's thoughts about a tree. One of the reasons that I went to do the Being a Beast project with my son Tom is that he has the glorious gift of dyslexia. And that means that he doesn't chop up the world into sets of propositions about the world. He encounters it, just like the mouse that I was talking about a moment ago. His inside is much closer to the outside than mine is, because he doesn't have the same tyranny of language, which creates a carapace between him and the world. Another important thing which is going on here, I think, is something which comes down to in McGilchrist's work. I mentioned him a couple of times already. I was trying in this project, this is another way of describing what I was doing, to learn to pay attention to the world in a more satisfactory way. So I expect everyone in this lecture hall knows the gist of McGilchrist's work about the hemispheres. So essentially, wherever we can see a nervous system, there is asymmetry in that nervous system. And that asymmetry is necessary because we need, for our survival, to have two completely different types of attention to the world. So imagine a pigeon which is trying to peck at a piece of grain in front of it. It needs to have a narrow, focused type of attention, and it needs to have a sort of attention which is linked to grasping. So in us, that's the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere, of course, governs our right hand, our manipulating hand. But if we only have that sort of attention, we're not going to survive to the next meal. The pigeon isn't going to survive to the next meal because it's not going to notice the fox which is crouched in the bush, which is about to jump on it and eat it. So it needs a wider sort of attention, a more holistic sort of attention, a sort of attention which doesn't categorize, which doesn't prejudge, which doesn't slot everything into its own categories. A much more relational sort of attention. And Gilchrist, as you know, thinks that there is a radical revolution which has taken place over the last 3,000 years or so. The left hemisphere, which is supposed to be the administrator, the executive, has arrogated the function of the right. So we have the wrong sorts of attention to the world. So if we have a stroke which devastates our right hemisphere, we see a person as the parts of the person, not the whole thing. And that, it would seem to me, is what we're doing in relation to the whole world. We have a type of attention which deconstructs, and badgers don't do that. The conversation between a badger's left and right hemisphere is a much more respectful and functional one than in human brains.
I'll let that go. But it brings us on to the second element of what I wanted to discuss, which is obviously you believe that the Upper Paleolithic people as well had a much better relationship, if you like, between left and right brain. But you talked, this is the meat really of a lot of what you were saying, because your book, Being a Human, traces the development of human consciousness over about 40,000 years.
Yeah.
From the Upper Paleolithic, which you described, to the Neolithic, when we start to draw lines, you put it sometimes, we start to do husbandry and we control nature, and in the sense we also control our own minds, limit our own minds in the process of doing that. In doing husbandry, we also restrict our own minds. And then you go on to the Enlightenment period, which in a sense, if you interpret the Enlightenment as being the scientific revolution and scientism and the application of scientism to all kinds of realms where it previously not been regarded as applicable, you get this somehow, and it's clear in your work, and I've never seen you actually talk any differently, that for you, that Upper Paleolithic period was some kind of high point in human evolution. And since then, we've somehow, in the way that we engage with the world, and which is about how happy we are as individuals and how we treat other people and how we treat nature, there's been a regression from the Upper Paleolithic period. Is that fair?
Yes, there's been a sort of fall. And it's a fall which can be described pretty well in terms of the hemisphere hypothesis. So yes, when we moved into the Neolithic, we became sociologically much more conservative creatures. We lived in smaller places. We drew literal lines across the land. We built fences, but we also built fences across our own minds. We started to value abstract categories in a way that we didn't before. We became literally less well integrated. And it was a time when control started to be a much more important part of what we did. We manipulated the world with our actual metaphorical right hands, and therefore with our left hemispheres, in a way which would previously have been seen as sacrilegious. And then when we come to the Enlightenment, what we've got there, I think, is a systematic desouling of the world. So, as I was saying, we had in the Upper Paleolithic, as all hunter-gatherers at all stages of evolution have, an idea of the world as an intrinsically unsouled and sacred place. And Descartes began the desoulment, and for a while humans were allowed to hang on to their souls, but even they were snatched away eventually. And that was morally very significant.
Animals for Descartes were machines. He
Absolutely. So the world was reconceived as a machine.
He dissected live dogs,
Yeah,
and he thought the screaming was like the metal rubbing together
Yeah.
of a machine.
so the world, the whole cosmos was reconceived as a machine, which is very ethically problematic because there is something obviously ethically dodgy about smashing up, killing an ensouled thing. There's nothing so obviously ethically problematic in smashing up a machine.
Nevertheless, I think some of the audience may regard this as a fairly strange proposition, that the highlight of the development of human consciousness was in the Upper Paleolithic period, and there's been a regression since. And they might put it to you like this, that your life has been incredibly full. You've been trained as a veterinary surgeon, you've been a barrister, you've written books, you've been an academic. When would have these opportunities to engage with the world have arisen in the Upper Paleolithic period? Is it really a loss in the way that you present it?
Unquestionably. So if I look at the experiences that I have now, which I value the most, they are the ones which don't fit into the hunter-gatherer world at all. They're ones which are defined by the categories which I've created for myself. And just going back to my example of the tree, I imagine that trees are more interesting than my ideas about them. So I have been forced by the catastrophe of my enlightenment cognition to live inside my own cosmos of self-created categories. So I haven't lived, and I don't think many of us do live, in the real world. We have a confusion of data with wisdom. So we have an infinite amount of data, so I certainly know more things, more pieces of information about the world, in some senses, that a hunter-gatherer would know, but that doesn't give me the sort of knowledge of the world which is really valuable. It doesn't give me wisdom, is one way of putting it. So I would like to think that the project of philosophy still can be described, at least to some people, as the love of wisdom. But that doesn't seem to be what it is. It seems these days to be the pursuit of data, which is a radically different project, and one which doesn't satisfy us.
Yeah, so I guess
there seems to be almost an inverse correlation between the amount of information we have.
Though you are able to
thriving.
engage in the world in all these different ways in which you have done in these different areas of life, but it's all nevertheless still not getting to the truth of the world, or living as rich a life as you might be able to do had you been back in the Upper Paleolithic period.
The Upper Paleolithic mindset was, so far as one can gather from extrapolations from modern hunter-gatherers, a mindset which was much better at reading things between the lines. And it's only between the lines of things that the real value lies.
Come back to that. You are quite damning, aren't you, about people who might want to work in the financial services or in merchant banks. One thing that I liked that you wrote, I did like this, was that anybody who'd done a philosophy degree and went into a merchant bank should have the degree taken off them because they clearly hadn't understood philosophy. They'd proven it by going into the merchant bank.
So
and more than that, in this academic environment, the lecturer should be downgraded.
So that was a proposal I made, yeah.
The lecturer should be downgraded because they haven't taught the philosophy very well.
Yeah.
Because instead of contemplating...
Yeah, there is no account of human thriving ever articulated, which is consistent with work in most of the high-profile jobs which most university graduates aspire to enter. Yeah. So if as someone who teaches philosophy at a university, somebody wants to go off and work at Goldman Sachs, that is a personal failing on my part, and it should be reflected in my ability to pay my mortgage.
Yeah, I'm inclined to take that point without agreeing with the general argument. So, I mean, we're now in a very complex. We live in a very complex society. Neither you nor McGilchrist or any that you wouldn't say we can somehow go back to an upper Paleolithic existence. You know, people like King's North sort of manifesto. We've got to prepare for Armageddon. We somehow got to live in the world we are. I think you say you rather than give up and accept, you want to find allies to try and make things better. How can we combine maybe what we have got from the benefits of science or what the left brain has to offer? How can we combine that in the modern world and still recapture some of the things which you claim we've lost since the Upper Paleolithic period?
We can do our best to redress the imbalance between the left and the right hemisphere. I think that's really what it comes to. I know I keep returning to this, but I think it's central. So, of course, we can't live as actual hunter-gatherers, but we can learn to pay attention in non-dysfunctional ways. We can see ourselves as what we really are, which is wild creatures. And the American naturalist and philosopher David Abraham puts this encouragingly well. So there is only ever a relatively unwild place. So an inner city shopping mall is a relatively unwild place, but still a wild place. If you leave a banana out in the shopping mall, you come back in a few days' time and it will be covered with a wild, uncontrolled and uncontrollable efflorescence of bacteria and fungi. And inside your gut, inside the great ecosystem which is you, there is a complex of bacteria and fungi. So if you can't get out into the wild world, take out a microscope and look at the bacteria on your own feces, and you will realize that you are a wild creature, and that wildness is necessary for you to survive because you are part of it. So I think there are ways of reconceiving, even in our own deeply dysfunctional, sedentary Western lives, what it means to be a wild thing. So even if we can't look out on a piece of green or a tree, which we know using all sorts of medical parameters is very good for us, we can still think of ourselves as the porous creature that our evolutionary biology and our sociology tells us that we are.
Yeah, and you made the point that a great period of our evolution we were hunter-gatherers. And for that reason, I guess, your period living as a hunter-gatherer in the Derbyshire wood with Tom again, he's okay?
You know, when I talk about being a beast, some of which I did with my son Tom, and being a human, some of which I did with my son Tom, one of the questions which comes is, did the social services get involved? This sounds like a case for a snatch squad taking him into care. And it's always struck me as being a bizarre objection.
I would never ask that question.
No. What
Not
is
now, anyway.
what is child abuse is to sit a child in front of a screen in a centrally heated house. That's the aberrant abusive behavior. Not letting children be what humans essentially are.
But that was a much more successful experience for you for the reasons I mentioned, because there's still a lot of hunter-gatherer in us. So,
Yeah.
And sort of living in that wood in Derbyshire, this is when, in a sense, many of the things that were beyond the Homo economicus came to the fore. The ghosts start to appear,
Yeah.
the wood takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
So you are starting to enter a different reality and a different way of perceiving yourself as human.
Yes, but it's a reality which is accessible even if you're sitting in your centrally heated house in central Hull.
Is it?
I think so. It helps to be starving in a wood, but you can create a wild wood in front of the TV if you get your attention directed aright.
Okay. One of the most powerful points you make, I think, or I feel that you make in your work, is that the story that we tell ourselves about human beings today, that we're sort of economic units, somehow caught up in some sort of materialistic desire for more and more, well, I'm taking it forward, but we're economic units, is a really sad story, and we're far more than that as human beings. And it seems to me that that's a very powerful message that you convey. And therefore we need other stories than this purely economic story. You do turn to religion quite often as one area where these stories have been developed in the past. I probably personally want to go down that route, but what kind of stories do you think we can tell?
Well, almost any story is better than the only one that we've got now, which is, as you said, Homo economicus, and on a broader scale, progress.
Yeah.
So it's deeply depressing, isn't it, that the only agenda of all political parties in this country is progress, growth. Growth is what's caused these problems. It's not going to be the solution to it. But I think it's unlikely as a matter of principle that we're going to get a new story which is better than the ones which have erupted over the last 45,000 years or so.
Be a pity.
If my reconstruction of the dialectic has anything to it, we are likely to have forgotten quite a lot about how to live over the last few thousand years or so. And so the further we go back, the more consonant with our human thriving are the stories which we're likely to find. So there is a remarkable consonance between the ancient stories which are told, the origin myths. As I hope I demonstrated, Martha Nussbaum's characteristics, if you look at them, are all ones which are hinted at, but hinted at in a far more fecund, explicit way by the stories which are ubiquitous and in all the world religions and all the non-religious origin myths. So I'm not suggesting that we should prescribe a particular story, but I'd just like us to observe that the stories that we have aren't anything like big enough for us. Every human being that I've ever met has struck me when I've gotten to know them as gigantic. And I've always been disillusioned that they are so often happy with a story about themselves which doesn't do justice to them. And almost anything, apart from the post-Enlightenment stories, does a better job.
Religion has become debased these days. I could depress you by telling you that Barclays Bank has just closed in Beverley, and you know where it's opening up? It's in Tolgavel Church. I thought Jesus was about chucking the money lenders out of churches.
Yeah, I mean it's unfortunate too that the power of these religious stories is becoming diminished because the left hemisphere has got to those too, and is recasting them in terms of the black and whiteness, the polarities, which the left hemisphere is so comfortable with.
It's a lucky I can't see the
stories.
I can't tell people for me to shut up.
but the stories that I was talking about are all stories where the implicit is the most powerful, and religion is really good in its original iterations at embodying the in-between-the-linesness, which, at least in the early hours of the morning, we recognize is essential to doing justice to the sorts of creatures that we imagine that we are.
Can I just finish then by asking about you're talking about us being edge creatures. Now, that was new to me. I haven't seen that in your work before, and I'm not sure I understand it. Because it seems to me that mostly we try not to be edge creatures. We try to hide the mysteries and the things on the outside and the dark things and the things that are troubling. And life is more like that. Are you saying that we become more alive when we actually do recognize?
I'm saying that the cosmos is a place which is characterized by edginess. It's a place which spawns individuation. But because it is one place, it is a place of intense and intimate relationality. Because we have lots of individuals within it, it's going to be a place which is characterized by everything being poised on the edge of itself and of everything else. And we are likely to thrive best if we acknowledge our own edginess. And I think that translates into lots of the wider observations that we can make about human thriving on edges. So, for example, I can't think of a single example of important innovation which has happened other than geographically at the center of anything. So cities, by and large, are only important in human culture because they gather together edge people. And they remain edge people, paralyzed often by imposter syndrome. It's impossible to point to a single great author in the golden age of Rome who actually came from Rome, apart from Cicero, who is not a good example. Evolutionary innovation, by definition, has to happen only at the edge of genetic orthodoxy, only at the edge, usually geographically, of a population, classically on islands. Insight into, well, real innovation in an artistic sense happens, as I've demonstrated through the Salvador Dali example, and there are many others, at the edge of the usual types of consciousness which we privilege certainly in the academy. So our daytime waking and that which we curate very aggressively in our universities is the least interesting and the least productive. And we ought to be thinking about how we reconfigure the academy.
Okay, I'm going to have to call it a day because we run out of time. I mean, this vision of what we are as human creatures is incredibly important, and I think you've conveyed that looking at it the way that you do changes not only the way we think about how we should live our own lives, also about how we should engage with other people, about how we should engage with other species, how we should relate to the natural world generally. And it also has, as we haven't got time to discuss unfortunately, but very important implications for the way we treat human beings, as you've shown yourself in medical ethics and in the law. So it's a very, very powerful statement that you're making, Charles, and thank you very much for doing that here in Hull tonight.
Well, I've enjoyed our conversation very much. Thank you for not interrupting when I pushed you right over the edge of your own patience and tolerance. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to Charles Foster and Mike Jackson for a truly thought-provoking lecture and discussion. So again, another round of applause, please. Professor Jackson will now present Professor Foster with an award to mark his contribution to systems thinking.
Right. It's the largest bit of plastic you've ever seen, Charles. But at least it's not going in the ocean. A fantastic book, Cry for the Wild, where Charles talks about different animal species which are suffering in the way that we engage with them and the way we're creating the world. And recommended it along with his other books. But this is let's just call it an outstanding contribution to thinking, because you don't like the system.
Thank you very much. I'm very kind. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you.
I have other people to thank for their tireless work behind the scenes. Heidi Westerdale, Sophie Turner, Tony Courts and their teams handled all the logistics, publicity and technical details, and this event simply could not have happened without them. So thank them all very much, please. If you have enjoyed this evening, and I sincerely hope that you have, then please do sign up for our Centre for System Studies newsletter, which provides information about future annual lectures, research events and our regular online systems cafes. So please look out for a follow-up email that will give you details of how to join our mailing list. Let me now close this 2024 Mike Jackson lecture with a final thank you and a round of applause for Charles Foster. Thank you all for attending, and I do hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.